We are available on Spotify and YouTube, so don't forget to subscribe for our latest episode.
This podcast is lit.
If you have low test scores, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems, but my class ain't one.
99 problems, but my class ain't one. If your test scores are low, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems, but my class ain't one.
Hello and welcome to the This Podcast is Lit podcast. With me, Mr. Firkins, Miss Ray. Hello, Miss Ray.
Hey.
Mr. Ackroyd. Hello, sir.
Hello.
And DJ Zoo.
Hello.
How's it going, sir? All right?
Yep, pretty good. Thank you very much.
So every week, Mr. Firkins, the only person you ask how they are is DJ Zoom. Is this like a really subtle way of buttering him up?
No, just...
I'm Miss Ray, I'm Mr. Ackroyd. How are you, DJ Zoom? Very transparent.
Always interesting to know what he's up to because he's the only one who seems to be absolutely loving lockdown. So, you know,
isn't it just
hear about a whinge and a moan.
Isn't it just the same answer every week?
Yeah, nothing.
How are you doing? Yeah, I'm all right.
Same as usual. Don't go outside. Loving it.
Yeah,
You just want to be me.
Have you actually said you're not all right, DJ Zoom, in any one of these last 8 weeks?
Never. I'm always good.
If you look at him, he's just dead behind the eyes. But it's not a video podcast, so it's fine.
Yeah. To be honest, there's a good tactic that is when you're talking to a group of people. If you don't really want to hear whinging and moaning, you pick somebody who you know won't whinge and moan, and you ask them how they're doing. So that's a little insight into some of my tactics, guys.
I'm just dubious that you think DJ Zoom's the least windy out of all of us.
Well, publicly he is.
Yeah, that's true.
Who knows what goes on behind closed doors?
Let's keep it that way.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, this week we are looking at, I have to say, one of my favourite poems. Absolutely love this one. Really excited to be exploring this one with you. It's from a poet called Jane Weir, and it's called Poppies. Guys, do you share my enthusiasm for this poem?
Absolutely. I think just the inclusion of so much imagery in it makes it a really, really good visual poem to be able to unpick. And you know I love unpicking, like symbols and motifs and stuff. So, yeah, I love it for that reason. Absolutely.
Mr. Ackroyd?
Yeah, I find it a fascinating poem. I find the use of the textile language quite fascinating as well, because she owns a textile factory. So it always quite interested me why she uses so many words to do with clothes and stitching. And when I found that out, it all kind of fits together.
Yeah.
Great poem.
There we go. And one way to get rid of what you two fools don't know ahead of time as well. So you might have used that one up too early.
That's page 4.
I'm being generous. I'm all about the giving.
Since when?
Since forever.
The last time you had to give somebody a present, I was the one that went and bought a birthday card for them. I don't think you're...
No, I'm not going to buy anything, am I? I'm not going to spend money. But, 3 bits of information I'm fine with.
Didn't your partner make her own birthday cake?
Yes. I don't do sweet food. I don't buy cards.
Birthday card?
I never buy cards.
Okay, well, there we go. Mr. Generous himself.
I don't see the point of buying cards. Ridiculous.
Our poem in a headline. Okay then, Mr. Ackroyd, time for some generosity. Let's hear your headline.
I've gone for The War of the Weeping Womb. So obviously the conflict element, the war element, the womb being symbolic of motherhood and protection, and the fact that her son's gone away and she's obviously grieving over that. And so I thought this puts all those elements together that I think the poem really zooms in on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, sir. I've gone with damned if she does, damned if she doesn't. And I've done that because I think this poem explores motherhood and that internal conflict, which is probably why it's in the power and conflict cluster, that conflict as a parent of what do you do really? Like, on the one hand, you're supposed to be supportive and you're supposed to embrace the idea that your child's got a passion in life and wants to go out and make a difference to the world. But simultaneously, there has to be that realization that this is an incredibly dangerous thing that they're going off to do. So it proves, her child does die in this conflict, in this war, and I can imagine there'd be a lot of not only grief but guilt at the fact that she didn't do more to potentially stop him or her going to war in the first place. So that's why I've come up with the headline, damned if she does, damned if she doesn't. She's just powerless for the whole situation. What do you do as a mother? Miss Ray, your headline.
I've gone for use of the word mother. I've gone for mother says goodbye again. Because I think there's 3 points in this poem where the woman is saying goodbye. She says goodbye to her child as they're growing up. She says goodbye to her child as she sees them off to war. And then she says goodbye to their child at the moment that they've died. And I think that's really interesting to look at those 3 different points in the poem and to see how, so obviously it's a power and conflict poem, to see where power and conflict is at each of those 3 different points and how it changes as it goes along through the chronology.
Fantastic. Okay then, DJ Zoom with the scores.
Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to have to give Mr. Ackroyd 5 out of 5. That got me some good laughs out of that. That particular one. Yeah, some interesting imagery you picked out there, Mr. Ackroyd, but definitely honing in on the idea of motherhood and kind of combining it with the conflict and war. 5 points. Mr. Firkins, I did damned if she doesn't, damned if she does. I think you had it the other way around, sorry. But yeah, it's so important that it's the realization of that, the child, letting go of the child and kind of powerlessness as well. So nice linking back into the cluster. And also Miss Ray, the mother says goodbye again. I like the idea of the chronological order. So getting the main ideas in there as well. So 5 points for you as well. 5 points overall for everyone.
Wow, what a start.
No, I'm not happy with the scoring, Mr. G. I think this is cowardly scoring.
What is the most important quote and why? This is our second segment, our second scored segment, where our panellists give you the quote, which in their opinion unlocks the whole poem. It's one which we believe that you should be revising, taking into the exam with you, and making sure that you've got some things up your sleeve ready to talk about it. I'm going to kick us off in this round this week, and I'm going to be looking at the third verse where she opens the door to a child, throws it open, and the world is overflowing like a treasure chest. And I'm going to pick this quote because for me, I just love the imagery. It's obviously a very sensual poem anyway, but when we start getting this type of imagery, it's quite spellbinding in a way. And I think that's exactly how the child views the world. And it goes to show her lack of power. The simile, like a treasure chest. The world outside is intoxicating, and she actually uses that word a bit lower down. The child wants to go out and experience the world and wants to be enriched by that experience. And I think that's why she compares it to a treasure chest. It's beautiful. It's worth so much, not necessarily materialistically, but in terms of experience. There's nothing she can do to experience that. And that's where that verb overflowing comes into it. The world is too much. There's only so much protection you can offer as a mother, especially once a child has grown up. This idea that the world flows into her own house is like the house is a cocoon, is where you keep your child safe, but the world actually breaks the door down, spills into her own house. And that's the lure of the outside world. That's her lack of power in a situation. That's how when a child reaches a certain age, there's only so much you can do as a parent. She obviously chooses to outwardly express support and love and understanding, but you can just tell that conflict inside. She's doing her best to keep that door shut, but there's nothing she can do. The world's coming in. Miss Ray, you second, please.
So I've chosen sellotape bandaged around my hand. And I've gone for this because you know by now that I love quotes where you can zoom into individual words, but I do also love a little bit of imagery as well. So I've chosen this particular metaphor. And the word that I want to really focus on today is that idea of that sellotape. So clearly she's wrapping the sellotape around her hand. And in the context of the poem, she's doing that to kind of remove the cat hairs from the jumper. But sellotape's really interesting because actually it's clear and it's see-through. So if you're wrapping that around your hand and bandaging your hand, that implies there's some sort of wound on your hand. And then that bandaging around of sellotape, which you can see through, means that you're not going to be able to hide that wound. So is she telling us that as a mother, the pain that she is feeling when she lets go of her child at each of these 3 individual milestones, she's never going to be able to hide that, because that pain is so deep and so real. And actually anything you are trying to fix it with isn't good enough to conceal it. But obviously sellotape is literally for fixing things. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and actually I use sellotape, and Mr. Ackroyd obviously doesn't, but most people do when you're wrapping presents. And then that makes you think about your childhood. And again, we're reinforcing the idea of the fact that this child, she still remembers them being incredibly young. And it then has connotations of things like birthdays and Christmases and things like that. Obviously, the bandage makes us think about wounds, and it has that direct correlation to war. But then the word around, the idea that she's not just putting a little bit of sellotape on her hand, but she specifically said she's wrapping it around. The idea that this sellotape is becoming all-encompassing. It's almost like it's suffocating her, and she can't escape from it.
Mr. Ackroyd.
Yeah, well, I've gone Maverick style here. And I'm going with the title. More so because I want to challenge myself, because I've always had a problem with this title. I love the poem, but not so much the title. Because it initially kind of sounds bombastic to me. It makes me traditionally titles of this sort used kind of for propaganda for brave soldiers, brave fallen heroes, in Flanders Fields, for example. So I've tried to work out why she decided to call it this, and I think I found a few reasons. Well, first, I think it forms a psychic link of the narrative. By watching the news 3 days before Armistice Sunday, she sees people laying the wreaths down. And this then drives the whole poem, because it's about remembrance. And she starts to remember. So those poppies are that symbol of her remembrance. Secondly, I think it specifically positions it as a war poem. Poppies are associated, obviously, in the wearing of them with the First World War, especially, but all wars after that, and recent wars as well. So it works as an emotive piece of symbolism, which signifies the bloodshed of war and the violence of war and the suffering that mothers go through as well as the remembrance. It's linked to death. Poppies grow in conditions of disturbed earth, and since the Napoleonic Wars, poppies have often grown around the graves of fallen soldiers. So that clearly tells me that the sons died, if you want to read it that way. The colour, the red, the scarlet red of the poppy suggests the blood spill in the war, but the red could also symbolise the power of love, more specifically a mother's love. The plosives in there, the poppies, the P sound contains the plosives, and watching the news where the poppies are being laid down could send off the explosions of memories popping in her head as she struggles to fight the grief. And finally, ever since ancient Greece and much of art and literature over the last 600 years, flowers are traditionally connected with femininity. And this links to the unique perspective of the poem. This is going to be it's going to be a war poem, yes, but from a female perspective, and again, more exactly, a mother's perspective. So I think that's why she decided to call it Poppies.
I like that.
DJ Zoom with scores.
The Maverick has definitely been very Maverick. That was, a lot of incredible analysis there, Mr. Ackroyd. I'm going to have to give you full marks for that.
Would Mavericks self-proclaim themselves as Mavericks?
I don't think so.
Getting on to existential questions now. I'm not self-proclaiming. I'm using my name in the podcast.
Which was chosen because you call yourself a Maverick.
Yeah, but I didn't tell you to put it on the podcast.
No, I didn't tell anyone to put brains on the podcast.
But no one's asking you to analyse my name. They're asking us to analyse the most important quote and why. And Mr. Jew was just telling us what he thinks. So shall we go back to that?
It's a very defensive Maverick this afternoon, isn't he?
Very defensive Maverick.
Full Maverick today. Okay, so for you 5 points, very well explained. Lovely idea. Lots of explosions. That's what. You could definitely steal that and put in the exam. I think you get some good marks out of that.
Certainly Maverick with our use of time in a half an hour pod.
TikTok.
I actually looked. I knew you were going to say that. I looked, and actually we were the same time.
Classic Maverick.
So Maverick's keeping an eye on time as well.
Evident. I'm learning so much.
Hoisted on your own petard there, Mr. Firkins.
I'll allow it. Next, this Ray with 4 points. The sellotape, very well explained again, bringing in all the kind of main points of the motherhood as well. And especially like the idea that it's see-through and that she's trying to hide something that you can't actually really hide and it's always there, isn't it? And that's a great point to make. And then also Mr. Perkins with 4 points, the overflowing like a treasure chest. I like how you linked it back to the your poem in the headline as well, and the idea of the powerlessness again, and how damned if she doesn't let him go see the world and get her treasure. So kind of it's a lose-lose situation, isn't it, for her? So yeah, great idea. 4 points for that.
There we go, guys. That's why you need to listen to your teacher, because it was only a couple of podcasts ago that Mr. G marked me down because I didn't link my quote to the headline. I listened, I acted on it, and I've ended up with 4 points. So there we go.
You've acted on your even better if.
It's the man who swayed me with his like massive analysis.
Yeah, it was bamboozling, wasn't it? It was yeah.
Intoxicating, I think is the word.
We won't go that far, but yeah. So
we're going to get meta. if we're going to get meta in terms of the quotes.
Okay. Well,
structure.
This is I think we maybe should start making this a pointed section of the show personally, but at the moment it remains an unscored segment of the show. We like to talk about structure, and we're going to kick off with Miss Ray, who's going to give us an insight into the poem structure.
And I've mentioned it already before, but my favourite part is the fact that it does seem to move between 3 different points in her life, and she structured it around those 3 really important moments in her life. And it just gives you the impression that actually she's kind of caught between these 3 moments. She's caught between being a mum to this young child. She's caught between being a mum to a soldier as they go off to war. And then she's caught being a mum to a soldier that's died. And actually it's almost like her life is frozen in these 3 moments and she can't move beyond them. So I think that's my favourite part about this poem in terms of its structure.
Brilliant. Mr. Ackroyd.
Yeah, I found quite a lot of caesura. 10 lines with caesura in it, which is quite a lot. And obviously thinking about why, it's the stopping, isn't it? That stopping, remembering. It's a poem about remembrance, as we said from Poppies, and it's that keeps the caesura makes us stop, like she stops and she's remembering the past and her past link to the child. I always find what interesting about this poem is we don't actually know whether the son's dead or not. It's just our reading of it. It never tells us he's dead. It might not be about war. There's alternative interpretations. I think we've got to go with our interpretation. I read it as if he has gone off to war and died. But you don't have to read it that way. It could be about a son leaving home as well. So it can work on as an extended metaphor as well.
Yeah, and the number of caesuras in it, like you say, the stop-go nature of it. It could be a lady, a mother, trying to find the right words as well, couldn't it? It could be that linking in with the damned if you do, damned if you don't, that sort of fumbling for the right things to say. And maybe that's why it's in there as well. Brilliant. What you fools don't know. Okay then, well, we're on to our final segment of the show, which is entitled What You Two Fools Don't Know. Miss Ray, over to you.
So, as a surprise to no one, I've gone to look at some more imagery, and I've gone to look at the imagery of songbirds. So obviously she references those in her poem. And now there's quite the standard kind of reading of those. Actually, songbirds in literature tend to represent things like spiritual longing and almost the idea that you are thinking about God and you are trying to locate that. But they do also have ideas about exile as well, which I thought was quite interesting, and the idea that you are being banished from a place. And I thought that was quite interesting because for me that kind of incorporates her 2 moods. Actually, is she kind of seeking some sort of higher power, higher knowledge to explain what's happened to her in her life? And then does she almost feel exile? Because if her child has gone to war and fought for the country that I'm assuming they both live in, I wouldn't be surprised if she kind of then felt othered and removed from that country. It does also then represent freedom, which is, again, something that we see in there quite a lot, that almost that freedom that she has to give her child in order to let that child grow up. And we get that conflict that we've already talked about before. But what I thought was really interesting is there's a little bit of a link to some Greek mythology. So there's a Greek story around the idea of Philomela. And now Philomela is a character in Greek mythology, and she has her tongue cut out And then she's changed into a nightingale, which is obviously probably one of the most famous types of songbirds. And that nightingale then laments in darkness and sadness, but chooses to tell us her story through her song. Now, is that Weir trying to tell us that the mum is the nightingale? She is using a song or a poem, that piece of art, to tell her story, despite the fact that she's lamenting in darkness. But one final thing that I thought was really, really interesting, that apparently in nightingales, it's only the male that sings. And I thought that's quite interesting that you see soldiers stereotypically as being these male figures. And I think Mr. Ackroyd talked about it earlier, the fact that it's often male poets and male voices you hear when it comes to war poetry. Actually, she's taken that, and she, as a female, she has taken that voice up and she is sharing her song.
Brilliant. Mr. Ackroyd.
Yeah, I'm going to carry on from exactly where Miss Ray left off. And again, I don't know whether it's a what fools don't know, but it's more what I find interesting, really. Sometimes I come at this from. And what interests me about this poem is her decision to base it on the perspective of a mother. I found what she said, that she said that she imagined Wilfred Owen's mother and what she must have been thinking. She also has 2 teenage children herself, so there's that untapped potential there. But I started to think about my own experiences as well, in terms of war poetry, and then literature and art as well. And actually, how much of it is how much of war literature and art is from a female perspective? I crawled into my brain. Yeah, it might not be very big, but an initial crawl in there suggests that my memories of war, literature and films, women are almost like they're there to further the male narrative. Yeah. There's a little bit of emotional juxtaposition, the generic sweethearts kissing goodbye to their brave soldiers, the mothers getting a knock on the door from an official from the military saying their sons died and then breaking down. But how many actually step into the shoes of a mother whose son's gone off to war? Well, I tried to research this and find some examples. I found a piece of art from a German expressionist that looked at gender, was a sculpture, it was okay. I found an American non-fiction book of letters, memoirs and interviews called Our Mother's War, but that was non-fiction, not literature. There's some pop culture bits, Land Girls, Home Fires, Our Girl, but they're really not anything from a mother's perspective, and they're quite domestic, yes, but I wouldn't call them literary. So I researched it further. This poem was actually commissioned by Carol Ann Duffy for a book called Exit Wounds. Carol Ann Duffy asked 16 contemporary poets to write a poem about war, and specifically a contemporary poem because war was raging in the Middle East through the noughties. So I researched this even a bit further and found there were 16 poems. One was on the inquiry into Iraq. One was from the perspective of a suicide bomber. One was about geography. One was by Carol Ann Duffy herself, which was just a series of generalized rhetorical questions and response. There was one poem by Gillian Clarke who talked about a city at war, and she gave one line to a mother who shut the door for the sound of gunfire. That's one line in a 22-line poem. The only poem in that 2009 book where this poem, Poppies, was published, was from a feminine perspective, was Poppies itself. And then I'm trying to think of literature and films throughout time, and I don't think there's many at all, if any, that's from a mother's experience. This makes this a rare and unique poem. This is a political act that Jane Weir's doing now, because we're succumbing to our own patriarchal archetypes here. It's the 21st century now, and we haven't had anything from a mother, arguably the most powerful force in the universe, and there's no literature or art on a mother's voice in the war. Final statement, back to the power and conflict. Jane Weir's giving a voice here, a new voice to a new genre, mother's domestic conflict. Shame on us. Brilliant. Well done, Jane Weir. True trailblazer.
Okay, guys, that's all we've got time for this week. So we'll see you next week for the podcast. Bye from us all for now.
Can I just say, I'm infinitely grateful that this is not a video podcast. That's all I'm saying.
I had an idea, I went with it.
You did, and for that,
be damned on time. Be damned on time. I will see my ideas through. My kids will be well, probably 2 of my students listen to this. I'll be thinking, I recognise that voice of Mr. Ackroyd. He's boring me to death there at the front of the classroom. I've missed that, so I've done it for those 2 students that just listen to this podcast. The rest, You can just fast forward it.
If those two students wouldn't mind stopping listening at any point, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Well, you're nothing if not thorough, Mr. Ackroyd. I'll grant you that. Okay, well, I'll try and keep mine short and sweet then. So I think when it comes to this particular poem, I think that both of you have absolutely nailed it, to be brutally honest. The area that I think speaks to me in this particular poem is exactly that. It was commissioned by Carol Ann Duffy. It was supposed to be about war, but it is a poem that transcends war. It's a poem which transcends time. You're absolutely right. It was written during the noughties, during the wars that are happening in the Middle East, but it can be applied for any war, to be honest. And what I also quite like is nowadays, we keep talking about the son. I think nowadays, many women in the army, and there's no reason why this couldn't be a daughter that's going off to war as well. And I find that quite an interesting little twist that might be the case reading it now. I also find it very interesting how the hero, to piggyback a little bit on what Mr. Ackroyd said, but maybe take it a bit further, the actual hero of this poem is definitely the woman. It's definitely the mother. Like the soldier, whether it is a son or a daughter, is intoxicated. It's not actually that brave to be intoxicated. It sort of just fell along with the crowd.
It's passive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a brilliantly brave decision to go towards, or presented as that in this poem anyway. But the person who is brave is the mother who's actually having to fight with all of these emotions, and not knowing necessarily the right thing to do, and not having a script to follow. Like you say, Mr. Ackroyd, there isn't a script to follow with any of this. It's not really that documented. So she is incredibly brave, and I think that you're absolutely right in saying that, therefore, this is probably one of the best poems in the cluster for that very reason. It's a completely different twist, a different way of looking at it. Finally, we're seeing things from this perspective, and I have to say, I think we need to see more of it. What I also like about this poem is how non-political it is, because a lot of the war poetry that we do look at criticises governments, criticises decisions, criticises politicians, whereas this poem cuts all of that out. And again, another reason why it's so transcendent. Anybody can read this poem, and I think anybody can take away what they want to take from it. It's relatable in so many different ways, and she's absolutely nailed it as a poem. It's a brilliant work of art. DJ Zoom with the scores.
I think Mr. Ackroyd could have had his own podcast with just that little bit there.
Maybe that could be a spin-off.
That could be a spin-off.
Just think how long it took me to prepare.
Crawl inside my mind, Mr. Ackroyd.
We're definitely keeping that.
I thought I'll just have a quick 5 minutes. I'll just have a quick 5 minute bit of research, and then 3 hours later.
I'll do you a special spin.
Nightmare.
You want to make use of those notes. But you first, Mr. Ackroyd. It was a very long part.
It was too
a
long.
Commentary. It was a commentary rather than an analysis, I thought.
Yeah.
It was too long. I admit that, but I was interested in it, so I went with it.
Yeah, some really great points you brought up as well, though, that not a lot of people do write from the perspective of a mother's voice, and most of the time it's just a kind of part of a narrative plot, or very domestic and not very much from a mother's point of view. It's a really good thing to, we need to kind of keep an eye on that when we kind of look at this poem. It's so important that we don't very often see it's the mother's perspective, not a female perspective, but a mother's, which is really important. But I'm going to have to tuck you points out. It's a very, very long part. It's 7 points for you, Mr. Ackroyd.
Is that 7 points deducted?
I don't know, 7 points instead of 3 points deducted.
One for each hour of research.
It's 7 hours. 10 hours next time, you might get something. Next is Miss Ray with the songbirds, the idea, the spiritualization and Philomena, that story. I love that idea that it's kind of the mother singing her song as well. Again, linking up very much to Mr. Ackroyd's idea. Great points, great bit of research, very nice idea we should bring into our analysis, a few 8 points. And then Mr. Firkin's idea of the mother as the hero. That is, I thought that's so important. That's something that's really key to this poem that I haven't really thought about myself, something that I haven't really thought about as a mother as the hero, rather than the men who are usually the heroes of war poems. And the fact that it's non-political again, something that I haven't considered. So for you, 9 points.
Fantastic. And time for some numeracy across the curriculum. What
Yeah.
does our leaderboard look like?
Okay, so numeracy in second place, joint second place is Mr. Ackroyd and Miss Ray with 17 points. And our winner this week with 18 points is Mr. Perkins.
Well done, Mr. Perkins. What's that?
It's all that buttering it up that happened before the podcast.
Yeah, a bit of emotional kind of connection before the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what our listeners...
I might try that next time.
Yeah, well, what our listeners don't know is that before the podcast started, DJ Zoom and I were talking about Call of Duty Warzone, and we like it, and Mr. Ackroyd decided to badmouth it and say it was against children, so maybe that's
Not quite
why.
so many words, I don't think, but yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah, well, yeah, I condense him. Modelling how to condense notes.
I thought that was a bit of creative writing there, Mr. Perkins, myself, but...
Okay then. So, wow, it's a great poem. I think that is a poem. If I was a student and I was going to be sitting this exam, I think that because we can link that poem to so many of the others, I think I'd probably have it as one of my favourites. We would definitely link with any poems to do with nature. There's enough natural imagery in the poem for that. Anything to do with war or any type of conflict, argument, inner conflict, turmoil, sort of goes with everything. Do we agree, guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we use that word contrast sometimes, don't we? And this is a good one to contrast against other poems, isn't it? Because you can take it down so many avenues, and that female mother perspective as well does kind of shine a new light on the poem and gives you a really good kind of springboard to contrast with the other poems.
Agree.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much then for today. We have been This Podcast is Lit, saying goodbye from the Maverick,
Bye.
the Brains,
Bye.
DJ,
Bye.
and me, Mr. Perkins. Bye all.